When Hellraiser was released in 1987, it came with the tagline, "He'll tear your soul apart." And that's exactly what happened when the leader of the Cenobites was introduced to the world of cinema, where he would become famously known as Pinhead, one of the greatest and most celebrated horror movie boogeymen of all time. In this haunting movie, audiences are introduced to the Lament configuration, a mysterious puzzle box which can unleash the ultimate in pleasure and pain, along with the terrifying Cenobites, demonic beings who cross dimensions. After the Cotton family move into their family home, the dark forces are unleashed in a twisted tale of deception, murder, and the gruesome return of a family relative, Uncle Frank. After solving the puzzle box, Kirsty Cotton must make a deal with the Cenobites for her to deliver them Uncle Frank, in return for them sparing her, in this truly graphic and confronting horror classic. So buckle up as we check out 10 things that you didn't know about Hellraiser, the original 1987 movie, all while ignoring those spam comments which seem to show up in nearly every comment that is left on my videos these days. Sorry guys, I hate to tell you this, but that's not me leaving those comments. Hey, if I did have a heap of PS5s, I would give them to you for free. But sadly that's just not the case. So let's check it out. Number 10. The origins of Hellraiser. Hellraiser is the creation of English horror and fantasy writer Clive Barker. The inspiration for this tale of pleasure and pain from terrifying realms came from his time as working as a night street worker in the 70s. It's been suggested that Pinhead's origins go back to a play that Barker wrote in 1973 called Hunters in the Snow, which featured a character called the Dutchman, who is said to be the genesis of Pinhead. However, Pinhead made his actual debut in the short story The Hellbound Heart, and the story was originally published as a novella in an anthology series called Night Visions 3 in 1986. However, it would later go on to get published as its own story later down the track. The short story was instantly loved and embraced by readers. Even Stephen King himself commented on Barker's talents, and said, "I have seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker." And of course, the Hellbound Heart would use the basic story that would go on to be seen in the Hellraiser movie, and even featured the leader of the Cenobites, Pinhead. Although in the original novella, he wasn't Pinhead. Though nameless, he was referred to as Hell Priest or simply just Priest, and in later adaptations he would be known as the Cold Man. The character wasn't named in the movie, but the name Pinhead was a term that fans used when watching the first Hellraiser film, on the account that he, well, had lots of pins in his head. You know, like the audience are being smartasses and giving the character a funny and not so flattering name, like the Porkins character in Star Wars. But more to the point though, Clive Barker hated the name Pinhead, feeling that it took away the character's dignity. However, the name Pinhead had become so common by the time the third movie came out, the character had officially become Pinhead, and that's how the character was credited in the titles. Going back to the original novella, there is also ambiguity over Pinhead's gender, as the Cenobites are described as their bodies having been modified so much they appear to be androgynous. And although the character Pinhead is referred to as a priest, the character is also described as having a female voice. Maybe we're just not meant to know, and maybe it was meant to be a mystery. Number 9. Sparing Hellraiser from being a crappy movie adaptation. Clive Barker didn't waste any time on getting to work on a movie adaptation based on his novella, what with the story being published in 1986 and then the movie being released in 1987. This is because Barker was unimpressed with previous movies being released that were based on his works. These included Underworld in 1985 and Raw Head Rex in 1986, So not to be disappointed yet again by someone else's interpretation of his work, Barker wanted to direct Hellraiser himself, where he teamed up with Dog Soldiers producer Christopher Figg, and New World Pictures stepped in to fund and produce the movie, giving it a budget of $900,000, which would go on to be stretched to $1 million, but more on that later. Now, Clive Barker had actually dabbled in movie directing before, by directing 2 short films. One being Salome in 1973, based on the Oscar Wilde play, and The Forbidden in 1978, based on one of his own short stories. But now Barker was making his first big feature film. Number 8. Suggested titles. So it's here we get to the movie's title, Hellraiser. It's sharp and quick to the point and takes no prisoners. So in essence, the title gets the job done, and it is a very appropriate title for a movie that's literally raising hell. As mentioned, the short story the movie is based off is called The Hellbound Heart, but it was decided very early on not to use that title. Apparently the studio felt that the title sounded too much like a title for a romantic love story. Barker's preferred choice was to just shorten down the title of his original story and for the movie to be simply called Hellbound. But it was in fact the movie's producer, Christopher Figg, who suggested calling the movie Hellraiser, and from there the movie got the iconic name. And it's just as well, as while filming took place, the movie had the rather bizarre title of Cenobites from Beyond the Grave. Yeah, look, that title does kind of sound like a cheesy B-movie, so I'm glad they went with Hellraiser. Number 7. Doug Bradley wanted his face to be seen. So as all Hellraiser fans know, Pinhead was played by Doug Bradley, and he is both memorable and iconic in the part. He is terrifying and has lots of command and power in the role, with no mercy, suggesting that this is one demon that you don't want to deal with. He also surprisingly had a lot of charisma, considering he had what looked like a heap of pins in his head, and he would quickly become a vastly celebrated movie boogeyman, right up there with Freddy, Jason, Michael, and Leatherface. Despite this though, when Bradley was offered the role of Pinhead, he was actually hesitant and nearly turned it down. Funny enough, the part he really wanted to play was that of one of the furniture movers who were briefly seen in the movie. Even though the roles of the furniture movers was nowhere near as memorable as the role of Pinhead, Bradley felt that at least audiences would be able to see his face, unlike the role of Pinhead, in which he would be under heavy makeup. So it was suggested that there be a switcheroo, that Bradley would play one of the furniture movers, and Oliver Parker, who was cast as one of the furniture movers, could play Pinhead instead. However, thankfully, Bradley did decide to play the lead Cenobite, as he realised that the character was a lot more interesting than that of a random furniture mover. So Bradley went under all the heavy makeup required and played the iconic role, where his character became not only the most standout part of the movie, but also the entire series, with him being more prominent in the many sequels that followed. It is said that when filming had finished, a wrap-up party was thrown, and most of the cast and crew didn't recognise Bradley, as they had never seen him before without his Pinhead makeup. The cast of Hellraiser also features Andrew Robinson as the hapless Larry Cotton, who many would recognise as the Scorpio Killer from Dirty Harry. Ashley Lawrence was cast as Kirsty Cotton, who would go on to star in several of the sequels, and Claire Haggans was cast as Julia Cotton. And despite the presence of Pinhead, she was actually intended to be the main villain of the movie and subsequent film series, but this was before the popularity of Pinhead really took off. But yeah, she was actually intended to be the face of Hellraiser. Higgins is still working today and has appeared in several productions, including Doctor Who and Sandman. Speaking of the furniture moving men, now this is something for the British audiences. The actor who played the larger built furniture mover, Dave Atkins, would go on to play Les the barman in the popular British 90s sitcom Men Behaving Badly. You know, just throwing it out there. According to IMDb, Lance Henriksen was offered to play Frank, but he turned it down, fearing if the movie was a success, then he would be forced to star in sequels, despite actually going on to star in a Hellraiser sequel, that being Hellraiser Hellworld in 2005, and apparently Jennifer Tilly auditioned to play Kirsty. But yeah, who knows if that's true. Number 6. Barker had fond memories of filming. Hellraiser was mainly filmed around London. The Cotton household, where most of the movie takes place, was filmed in a real house in Cricklewood in London. Once again, according to IMDb, it was intended for Hellraiser to be set where the movie was filmed, in London, and that it was going to be more of a British movie. But the studio who were backing the picture, New World, got cold feet with presenting the movie with its original English roots, and they felt that the movie would fare up better in the box office if Hellraiser felt more American. So instead, it was decided to make it ambiguous as to where the movie actually takes place. So a lot of the British actors who appear in the movie had their voices dubbed over with American voice actors. Thankfully though, after some hesitation, it was decided not to dub over Doug Bradley's voice. The shoot was intended to take place for 7 weeks. However, the shoot had actually stretched to 10 weeks. And despite his inexperience in making major motion pictures, Clive Barker has maintained that the cast and crew were very kind and supportive to him despite his lack of experience. One screw-up that did happen during the filming occurred during the scene at the Chinese restaurant, as according to good old Wikipedia, the person who was responsible for letting the cast and crew in the restaurant turned up late, and because of this, that scene had to be hastily shot really quickly. Oh yeah, and Doug Bradley did have some trouble while performing as Pinhead in front of the camera, as he couldn't see thanks to his black eye contact lenses, and thus he was afraid of tripping over his Cenobite skirt. Still, because Bradley's performance is so flawless, you honestly wouldn't think that he had technical difficulties playing the part. So, kudos to him for that. Number 5. The special effects process didn't go down as smoothly. Something that was a constant issue when filming the original Hellraiser was its budget. Despite originally being given a budget of $900,000, Barker managed to convince New World to increase it to $1 million, and so to cut costs, he would have to use cost-effective means for filming, for example, shooting with a single camera. However, there was still no money left for special effects, as the production had dried up and completely run out of money, to which Barker himself worked on the effects on one weekend. A lot of the effects seen in the movie were drawn by Barker by hand. Not to mention other special effects issues, like the engineer creature. For example, the engineer creature proved particularly difficult to film, as the prop was really difficult to maneuver, and the lament configuration box itself was put together by wood and pieces of brass. In fact, the designer who put the prop together, Simon Sace, was worried about the prop accidentally getting dropped and broken, as it took him a long time to put it all together. And it is said that he would lay on the floor during the filming of certain shots when characters, particularly the Cenobites, were holding it, so he was ready to catch it in case it was accidentally dropped. The special effects were so daunting to create for the film, supposedly Barker was drunk the whole time while working on the effects, due to its technical difficulties and the stress of it all. But to be fair, the effects in the movie do look pretty good. They are in no way creaky and they still hold up today. Number 4. Pinhead could have been a one-liner cracking wise guy. So the way that Pinhead was portrayed in Hellraiser, as we all know, was that of having a fearful command, full of intelligence and wisdom, and even a sense of nobility despite his ghoulish appearance. However, New World were a bit anxious to this approach. They felt that audiences may find him to be boring, so it was suggested to have the character cracking up jokes and coming out with one-liners, very much in the same vein as fellow movie boogeyman Freddy Krueger. I mean, look, you have to remember that this was at the time of the Nightmare on Elm Street craze. However, Barker was against this. So then there was another idea of just having Pinhead as a silent ghoul, one who doesn't say anything, taking after Jason and Michael. But Barker was also against this too. So thankfully he stood his ground and insisted to the higher-ups that Pinhead would come across as more threatening if he had an intelligent, commanding presence like Dracula. So thankfully the producers agreed, and Pinhead wasn't given a wise-talking makeover or made into a mute silent killer. That's not the only changes made to the Cenobite gang, as the Chatterer and Butterball Cenobites had dialogue in the original script, but it was decided to make their characters silent, as the actors who were performing as the grotesque characters just simply couldn't talk underneath all that makeup. So I guess you win some and you lose some. Number 3. The movie's score had to be reworked. So Hellraiser represents one of those rare occasions when a movie score would have to be redone entirely. Barker originally wanted the music in the movie to have an electronic score, so he got British experimental group Coil to create the music for Hellraiser. Now, I've never heard of Coil before, but from research I've done, it makes sense that Barker would want to hire them, as their music often explored themes of sexuality and the occult. In fact, the same year Hellraiser came out, the group released an album called Gold is the Metal with the Broadest Shoulders. And is it just me, or does the album cover kind of look like the Lament configuration puzzle box? However, back to the producers, they weren't happy with the music that was made for Hellraiser, so American composer Christopher Young was hired to come up with a new score. At that time, Young had previously scored the music for A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, and would continue to have a successful career scoring movies, where he is still scoring big Hollywood movies to this day. And I've got to say, his Hellraiser score is great, as the music in the movie sounds very orchestral and epic. Some of the music Coil had written for Hellraiser would be written into Young's score, and some of Coil's recording sessions for Hellraiser would also feature in their as-mentioned album, Gold is the Metal with the Broadest Shoulders. Man, I don't know why I have so many difficulties saying that title, but I just really do. Hey, just don't forget that scores being replaced in movies is something that has happened a few times. Heck, even the legendary Jerry Goldsmith had several scores rejected. So, it happens. Number 2, avoiding an X rating. Without a doubt, Hellraiser is a pretty brutal film with intense, gruesome visuals and confronting themes, so naturally there were bound to be issues with its rating. The MPAA originally gave Hellraiser an X rating, which is a rating that no movie production wants, so Barker had to make edits and cuts to reduce it down to an R rating. The MPAA's biggest issue was a grisly murder scene that involved lashings of gore and nudity. The scene had to be reshot entirely to rule out the nudity, as well as removing an extended scene of seeing Uncle Frank being torn apart, and a later close-up where his guts can be seen. Well, I guess if that doesn't put you off your popcorn, nothing will. The original cut also played up more on the erotica elements, with the sexuality being a more intense part of the movie. But the MPAA didn't like this either, so the movie's sexual elements had to be toned down. Hellraiser is already a pretty full-on film, so just imagine a version that was even more brutal and confronting. Several bootleg copies of the uncut version would circulate around Germany, until this version was officially released in 2011. Number 1. Cenobites Unleashed. It was anticipated that Hellraiser wouldn't be a hit. Some apparently predicted that it would be a straight-to-video feature. But despite this, Hellraiser was released for the first time at the Prince Charles Cinema in the West End of London on the 10th of September 1987. And it would go on to make nearly $15 million on its $1 million budget, so financially the movie was very successful. However, the movie was initially banned in Ontario, mainly for its graphic imagery, but it would eventually be allowed to be shown after certain cuts and trims were made. Hellraiser got lots of praise in the UK. A magazine called Melody Maker even described it as the best horror film ever to be made in Britain. It was considered a triumph directing debut for Clive Barker, and was seen as a more menacing return to form in the horror genre in the days of more comical horror franchises like A Nightmare on Elm Street and Evil Dead, movies which were the norm at that time. Hellraiser, though, got more of a mixed reception in the US, with the critic that we all love to reference, Roger Ebert, who really didn't like it at all. He found it to be dreary and felt that the movie was without wit, style, or reason, and that it has a bankruptcy of imagination. Wow! Well, gee whiz, who pissed in his sandwiches that day? The audience, however, did love it, and Pinhead not only became a mascot of the horror genre of that time, but also a leader, one that has a true sense of power, authority, and nobility, who would rise up in the ranks above your average horror movie killers. Hellraiser's popularity would continue to climb higher and higher and gain a larger fandom with the passing of time, where it's now considered a horror movie masterpiece and a genuinely unique and terrifying horror experience. And it often makes it to lists of best horror movies of all time. So to this day, audiences continue to seek both the cinematic pleasure and pain of Hellraiser, and can't seem to get enough of this truly confronting and nightmarish work of art. Yep, Hellraiser is definitely a horror experience unlike any other, and its intensity and shocking visuals haven't aged with the passing of time. They look just as shocking now as they did all the way back in 1987. Just maybe don't watch the movie on a full stomach, as it's pretty gross. Yep, there are plenty of yucky bits. But it's a movie that once you watch and get to the credits, you're glad that you experienced it. It is a rewarding view. Anyway, I'm Minty, and remember, the Cenobites are demons to some and angels to others. Although, in my opinion, they're just frickin' demons. I mean, look at that! That's a demon. See ya!